Hello, Steve Smith here, and welcome to another presentation about language teaching. This is the fourth in the series, and it's another one about listening, this time interpersonal listening. So I'm Steve Smith, that's my Twitter handle and my blog, and I just want to plug informedlanguageteacher.com, where you can find all sorts of research, readings and videos and podcasts which may be of interest to you. So grab your cup of tea or coffee and belt up for about 15-20 minutes. Let's see how we go. Just before I kick off, I just want to remind you, in case you don't know me really, this is my website, frenchteacher.net, where you can get hold of all sorts of resources at every level for French for a very low fee, and there are lots of free things there as well on the site. So that's one of my main activities that keeps me out of trouble during the day. If we get on to our topic for the day, let's just move me over there. Interpersonal listening. So far we've talked about the process approach to listening and building up the micro skills to create more confident listeners. Now, if you think about it, most of the listening that students do is not necessarily to audio or video. It's the day-to-day conversations that they have with their teachers or with their classmates. And that's going to be one of their main sources of input. And when it comes down to it, one of the basics of language acquisition is you need input. Now, comprehensible input was the term that was made particularly popular by Stephen Krashen, who you can see over here, very, very influential researcher. And his message was that effectively all you needed were messages that you could understand, either ones that you hear or ones that you read, and that nature takes its course. You acquire a language. And indeed, there's an awful lot in that, and it's kind of, no one really disagrees that comprehensible input is the key to language acquisition. But it got more complicated in time, as Meryl Swain in particular felt that if you want students to become accurate as well, then they need to produce output. And so she came up with the comprehensible output hypothesis, which allows students to recognize where they have weaknesses and so on. I think we also need to keep in mind when it comes to output what's called the production effect or the generation effect, which is a phenomenon that's been recorded in cognitive psychology, where if you speak, you tend to retain that knowledge more than if you just receive it passively. So that could be taken as an argument for encouraging students to speak. Then if we go down through the history, sort of nearer to the modern time, we then get something called the theory of modified interaction. In other words, speakers need to modify their output to make it comprehensible, and this helps with acquisition. So Donato, for example, and Meryl Swain then talked about collaborative interactions. As students interact with their peers or teachers, they often talk about the language, they question their own language use, and so on. So, we need input, we also need output. Input and interaction, they're some of the fundamentals. Now, one of the ways to generate interpersonal listening and conversations is through what are sometimes called display questions, sometimes referred to as circling, particularly by teachers who use the TPRS approach. But it's using the full range of question types, where questions are used as a device to generate repetitions and to generate listening. So if you look at this table here on the slide, we've got on the left here a series of question types, starting from the very easiest, those that demand the least processing, to the hardest. So I put these in English, but if you simply said, Paul's an actor? Yes or no. That doesn't demand too much decoding, and it demands a minimal response, but it's a source of listening. If we then use a different question form, so in English if you change the word order, is Paul an actor? That needs a little bit more processing because of the change of word order, and in the language that you teach there'll be other ways of changing the question form. We then have the sort of classic either-or question, is Paul an actor or a journalist, where you're giving two alternatives, and students here need to decode a little bit more in the input, but nevertheless they still have something in the input that allows them to give an answer. In this case, he's an actor or he's a journalist. This can then be moved on to take the form of a multi-choice question, a bit more to process, but still the answer is in the question. And then if we jump up to the question word question, for example here, what does Paul do for a living? Well, that's a much harder question to process because the answer is not in the question. So for students, that poses more of a problem. And then you can even go on to broader questions like, what do you think of Paul, and so on. Now, this sort of questioning technique was a staple of the oral situational approach, which developed mainly in Britain during the 20th century. And that was a staple of many textbooks, say from the 1960s onwards. And although these sorts of questions are quite contrived, they nevertheless serve a very useful purpose because they allow you to control the target language you use and that students hear, and to generate repetitions. So whether you're working with beginners or right up to advanced level students, you can work up and down this sort of hierarchy of question types and even differentiate between different students by asking different sorts of questions. So if you have a weaker student, you might go for a simple either-or question. If you know that the student has higher proficiency, then you could try a more difficult question lower down the hierarchy. But in any case, you can work up and down the hierarchy to give some variety. So this is all about question-answer technique. But when you're interacting with a class and providing listening input in this interpersonal way, questions aren't the only way of doing it. An obvious one that you may use already is just to give false statements, which students have to correct. So you might say, Amelia often goes to the swimming pool, and students come back and say, no, she goes to the cinema. Or we can have answer versus question as opposed to question-answer. So in this case, you give the answer, she prefers action movies, and the students have to come up with the question, what type of film does she prefer? So that is a reasonably demanding task because students here aren't getting anything from the input to produce their question, but if you've been working on question formation, then that can be a useful activity to do. Now, aural Gapfill, that's the name I give for this sort of exercise. It's a little bit like what I described in the last presentation called disappearing text. But let's say you've been working on some sort of text during the lesson. You then hide the text and give students the starts of sentences which they have to complete orally or even on paper. So you might say, her favourite Avenger, and they complete, is Iron Man. And the nice thing about this one is that it works on short-term memory. Students are usually quite good at that sort of thing, and you can tailor the gaps to the individual class. So if the class is a weaker class, you give them more input, they provide less. If they're a much stronger class, you might just be able to provide, one word like her, and they could come back and say, favourite Avenger is Iron Man. All of this, by the way, is generating repetitions, recycling language, and helping to build long-term memory. And notice how this sort of technique also, as I point out at the bottom, it helps students divide the sound stream into meaningful words and chunks. An alternative is to start the sentence. So instead of you giving the beginning and they provide the end, you give the end. So you would say, to the Odeon, and they might say, I went with my friend. This does obviously give you, potential for amusing creativity on the part of the class. And this sort of activity would make a very good starter or plenary for a lesson if you just wanted to retrieve some language that you'd used recently. In this sort of activity, repeat the last few words. You could just warn students that every now and again during the lesson you're going to ask someone to repeat the last few words you uttered. So that might encourage full attention if you're doing the sort of lesson which is teacher-centered. And by the way, you can see here that I'm not particularly discouraging the idea of teacher-centered work. I think there's a lot of value in pair work, sometimes in group work, but also the teacher as a source of listening input is absolutely vital. So I wouldn't be ashamed at talking a good deal, provided it's interesting and that it's comprehensible and students are listening. And to check students are listening, you're going to have to use your usual box of tricks, and whether it's mini whiteboards or your generic teacher skills like scanning the class left to right, front and back, using cold call questioning, for example, to make sure that everyone's on board. Now, here's a text that I sometimes use if I'm doing training sessions to just show how these sorts of oral interactions can work. So this is a simple French text. Even if you're not a French specialist, I think you should be able to understand a good deal of it. So you need to imagine here that you're a student, a near beginner student, and I'm the teacher, and you imagine what answers you'd be giving. So if I were teaching a short text like this, personally I'd start by reading it aloud, making sure that students are following either with their finger or maybe with a ruler. So a first reading aloud, then I do some choral repetition. So I'd read phrase by phrase up to a full sentence, and the whole class repeats phrase by phrase. I might use that technique I described in the previous video called back chaining, the one where, for example, on this word principal, I might say to the class al. They repeat al. Pal, ipal, sipal, incipal, rincipal, principal, which is quite a fun activity. That's called back chaining. So we've done reading aloud. I've read aloud. We've done some choral repetition. Now, provided you've been rigorous about the quality of the work they're producing, you might just work on just one section of this text, not the whole text. And then students could have a go reading for themselves, perhaps in pairs, to make sure that it's still quite unthreatening, because reading aloud is quite a threatening task for students. You can then monitor what they're doing in pairs. Incidentally, students can read alone. If they put their fingers in their ears, they can read and hear themselves reading without having other people listening, so that reduces the threat level. So let's suppose we've done those initial reading aloud sort of tasks. That could easily take, say, 10 minutes or so. And then we get into some questioning techniques. So I might be saying things like, OK, Peppa Pig, c'est une cochonne ou un crocodile? Peppa Pig, c'est une cochonne, un crocodile ou un dinosaure? Peppa Pig, elle habite une maison, oui ou non? Elle habite une grande maison, oui ou non? Peppa Pig, elle habite dans un appartement? Où est-ce qu'elle habite? Elle habite avec son frère ou sa sœur? Comment s'appelle son frère? Il s'appelle Frédéric? Il s'appelle Stéphane? Alors, je vous donne une phrase fausse. I'll give you a false sentence, you correct. Peppa Pig est un dinosaure. Elle habite un appartement. C'est le fils de la famille. Elle porte une robe grise. Elle porte des sandales. You've got the idea. So there, I just used a range of questions and some false statements, maintaining target language use at a very comprehensible, easy level, whilst encouraging some fairly unthreatening output from students. So this is very, very controlled activity, maintaining target language, keeping the input comprehensible all the time. Now, how far you take that depends on the class, but that principle can apply right the way through to advanced level classes. But of course, at more advanced levels, your questioning is going to be less contrived, and it might actually be genuine inquiries about the content of the text. So, if you like, one of the major takeaways of this is, if you think of question answer and that sort of interaction, I'd think of the advantages of working with short texts very intensively and repetitively rather than with longer texts superficially. And the variety you bring into your lesson is going to come not so much from the text itself, but from the range of activities. So that great teacher skill of, if you like, giving a twist to an activity to make it seem different, but it's actually reusing the same language in slightly different ways. And by doing this, I think that's how you can create mastery and self-efficacy. It's a question of, getting mastery, not just coverage for the sake of it. Because you can imagine that you've covered a lot from a textbook, but actually it might be very superficially mastered. So Michael Swan, an English language teacher and writer, refers to this sort of work as intensive input-output work. And to me, that's a fundamental of effective language teaching. Of course, much depends on the context here, and I'm talking mainly about secondary school children who are learning, say, a foreign language for the first time without too much input in their real lives. So I'm not talking about the sort of situation where, let's say, EFL students who already have some English are developing their skills, and they might be better suited doing more task-based work and so on. So this intensive work gives more chance for the input you receive to be processed by the brain and remembered to go into long-term memory. So just a few references for you on this, and let me just move myself over there. Just a few readings there that I quoted from the presentation. Do have a look at Stephen Krashen's work. I mean, he started putting his work online free a long time ago, and there's a whole book called Principles and Practice in Second Language Acquisition, which you can find at that address. You can find out about the Swain output hypothesis, and there's a nice article by Michael Swan you might want to look up. I'd also mention the Informed Language Teacher site once again. That's got references to the output hypothesis and the input hypothesis. And to finish off, can I just point out the work that Gianfranco Conti and I did on breaking the sound barrier, and our earlier book called The Language Teacher Toolkit, which is a kind of fairly thick manual for language teachers, but with a mixture of research and lots of practical ideas. And this book on the right here, which I wrote in 2017, focuses a lot on the techniques of questioning and has some chapters in it with the title Dissecting a Lesson, where it breaks down the questioning process into a lot more detail, particularly useful perhaps for newer teachers to the profession who are planning lessons and how exactly to maintain target language use. So that's it for this session. Thank you very much for tuning in. And in the next session, it'll be the last one for now about listening. And I'm going to look at task-based listening. Bye.